There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a hospital room when the doctors have said everything they know how to say and left the family to do the rest. Not peaceful exactly, more like the stillness of a held breath that doesn't know yet whether it will be released. Room 412 at Meridian General had been holding that kind of stillness for 3 days. The man in the bed was named Elliot Ashford. He was 44 years old, which was young by most measures and felt very young in a hospital bed, with monitors charting the reluctant persistence of his heart and tubes doing the work his body had. For reasons the medical team had exhausted themselves trying to fully explain, partially stopped doing on its own, he had been found unresponsive in his home office on a Monday morning by his housekeeper, which had led to the ambulance, which had led to the ICU, which had led to 72 hours of the best neurological care that money, and Elliot Ashford had considerable money, could arrange. The diagnosis was a severe hypoxic brain event. The cause had been identified and addressed. The damage, however, was the damage, and the damage was significant, and the 3 specialists who had consulted on the case had delivered their assessment with the careful, compassionate precision of people who had learned over long careers how to say hard things clearly without saying them cruelly. The likelihood of meaningful recovery was very low. The vegetative state could be permanent. The family should begin thinking about what Elliot would have wanted. Elliot's sister, Margaret, who was 51 and had flown in from Portland and who was, of all the people in that room across those 3 days, the one holding everything, together with the visible effort of someone who refuses to let go of a rope no matter how much it costs her hands. Margaret had thanked the doctors, asked them 3 precise and intelligent questions, and then sat back down beside her brother's bed and taken his hand and not moved for a very long time. There was no other family. Elliot had never married. His parents were gone. Margaret was what remained, and Margaret was still there, and she intended to keep being there for as long as there was anything to be there for. Constance Rawlings had worked for Elliot Ashford for 9 years. Housekeeper, though the word never quite covered it. She managed his home the way a person manages something they genuinely care about, which is to say attentively and without being asked. She was 46, a quiet woman from a small town in eastern Tennessee, with strong hands and the particular efficiency of someone who had never had the luxury of wasting anything, including time or effort. She had been the one to find him on that Monday morning. She had called the ambulance, stayed until it arrived, given the paramedics every piece of relevant information she had in a clear and rapid sequence that the lead paramedic would most useful handoff he'd had from a bystander in years. Then she had gone home, because there was nothing else she could do, and she had sat in her small apartment and held her hands in her lap and felt the particular helplessness of caring deeply about someone's life when the people with the power to affect it have taken over and there is nothing left for you to contribute. She had a daughter, Millie, 3 years old, small for her age, with her mother's quiet eyes and a way of moving through the world that was, for a toddler, remarkably unhurried. Millie had come to the house with Constance sometimes. On weekend mornings when Constance had a half day of work and no childcare, and Elliot Ashford, who was in most professional contexts a serious and somewhat remote man, had consistently, without comment, made space for the child, left a box of drawing supplies in the kitchen, remembered inexplicably that Millie preferred apple juice to orange, once sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes while Millie showed him how to build a tower out of wooden blocks, with the focused patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and was, in that moment, genuinely nowhere else. Constance had never forgotten that. The way some people treat the small and powerless tells you more about them than any amount of professional reputation, and what Elliot Ashford's behavior toward a 3-year-old told Constance was that there was more kindness in him than most people who knew him professionally would have guessed. On the 3rd day, when the doctors had said what they said, Margaret called Constance, not for any particular reason, just because grief needs to go somewhere, and Margaret was running out of places to put hers, and Constance was the person who had known Elliot's daily life better than anyone. They talked for a long time. At the end of the call, Constance asked if she could come. Just to sit, she said. Just to be there. Margaret said yes. Constance brought Millie because there was no one to leave her with. and she almost didn't go for that reason. Almost called Margaret back and explained, but something, some instinct she couldn't have articulated, the kind that lives below language, told her to go anyway. She dressed Millie in her pink dress, the good one, because Constance believed in dressing properly for serious occasions, and she brought Millie's bear, whose name was Thomas, because Millie did not go anywhere important without Thomas. The nurses at the ICU desk knew Constance. She had been there every day. They looked at the toddler and at Constance and made the small, quiet accommodation that nurses in long care units learn to make, the recognition that the official rules and the human reality don't always align perfectly, and that a wise person knows when to hold the line and when to step aside from it. Room 412 was dim when they arrived. The curtains half drawn, the monitors doing their steady, metronomic work, the room smelling of antiseptic and the particular neutral air of a space that has been lived in by sickness for several days. Margaret was in the chair beside the bed, her eyes closed. Not asleep, but resting the way people rest when they've been awake for too long and sleep has become unavailable. She opened her eyes when Constance came in. Looked at Millie. Something in her face shifted. The small, involuntary softening that the presence of a child produces in a room heavy with adult grief. Constance settled into the other chair with Millie in her lap and they sat. The three of them, in the particular companionship of people who are all keeping watch over the same thing, for the same reasons. After a while, Millie climbed down from her mother's lap. This was simply what Millie did. She was 3, and 3-year-olds do not sit still indefinitely, not even in serious rooms. Constance reached to take her hand, to keep her close, to manage her the way you manage a small child in a space where small children don't quite belong. But Millie had already crossed to the bed. She was too small to reach Elliot properly. She stood beside the bed and looked up at him with the steady, uncomplicated attention that very young children give to things they are curious about, without any of the social filters that adults apply to the sight of a sick person. She looked at the tubes, at the monitors, at his face, still and pale against the pillow, the stubble on his jaw grown in 4 days past its usual neat edge. Then she reached up and placed her small hand on his cheek, not tentatively, not the way a child touches something they're unsure of, with the complete natural confidence of someone doing something that makes obvious sense to them. She held her hand there and looked at him. "Wake up," she said, conversationally, the way she might say it to Thomas the bear when she wanted him to be part of a game. Constance's throat tightened. She started to rise, some instinct toward intervention, toward protecting both the child and the man from whatever this moment was. Margaret put a hand on her arm gently, and Constance stayed where she was. Millie kept her hand on Elliot's cheek. She wasn't talking anymore, wasn't performing anything. She was simply there, in the total and uncomplicated way that small children are present. Without agenda, without self-consciousness, without any of the layers of meaning and implication that adults bring to the bedsides of the very ill. Just a small warm hand on a cold cheek and a pair of quiet eyes, and Thomas the bear held against her chest with the other arm. The monitor kept its rhythm. The room held its breath, and then Elliot Ashford's eyes moved. Not open, not yet. Just the small, barely visible movement beneath. The lids that neurologists have a name for and that nurses who have worked in ICUs long enough learn to watch for the movement that is different from the random muscle activity of deep unconsciousness, different in a way that is difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. Margaret saw it first. She leaned forward without making a sound, her hand tightening on Constance's arm. Millie didn't react. She kept her hand where it was. 2 minutes passed. Perhaps 3. Time in that room had a different quality than time outside it. And then slowly, with the effortful uncertainty of something that has been very far away and is finding its way back from a great distance, Elliot Ashford opened his eyes. Not fully, just a fraction, enough. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, as if following the warmth, his gaze traveled down until it found the small face looking up at him. Millie, with her steady eyes and her bear, and her hand still, resting on his face as if she'd known all along he was coming back and had simply been waiting. With the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be, Elliot's lips moved. No sound came, not for a long moment. Then, barely audible, the word, "Hey." Constance made a sound she would not have been able to describe afterward. Margaret was already at the call button. Millie patted his cheek once, gently, with the satisfied air of someone whose plan has worked out exactly as expected, and said, "You were sleeping too long." The doctors came quickly, and in numbers, and did the things doctors do when something happens that the existing framework doesn't entirely account for. They were careful in their language, as good doctors always are, careful not to promise what they couldn't promise, careful not to over-explain what they didn't yet fully understand. What they could say and did say was that Elliot's responsiveness was meaningful, that the brain activity they were now seeing was significantly changed from the previous 72 hours, and that they would need to reassess everything they had told the family about prognosis. The reassessment conducted over the following days as Elliot moved from the ICU to a step-down unit and began the long, incremental process of recovering what he had lost, produced conclusions that the medical team described in terms of percentages and neural pathways and the remarkable plasticity of the human brain under certain conditions. None of them mentioned the 3-year-old. But Margaret did. Constance did. And eventually Elliot himself did. When his speech had returned sufficiently for him to tell the story, which he told quietly and without embellishment, the way he told most things, because what had happened didn't need embellishment. He remembered the hand on his face. That was the first thing he remembered, coming back from wherever he had been. Not pain, not light, not the monitors or the voices of the medical team. A small warm hand on his cheek, and a quality of presence that was, he searched for the word every time he told it, uncomplicated. Entirely without fear, as if there were nothing in the room to be afraid of, which had made him think, somewhere beneath everything, that perhaps there wasn't. Perhaps he could come back. Perhaps coming back was simply a matter of someone being patient enough to wait. The recovery took 8 months. Not a straight line, never a straight line, but a direction. And the direction was consistently forward, which was more than anyone had been prepared to promise in those first 3 days. Elliot relearned certain things, regained others. Some things came back exactly as they were, and some things came back differently, and Elliot, who had spent 44 years being a very particular kind of person, found that he was not entirely the same person on the other side of this, and found, to his own slow surprise, that this was not entirely a bad thing. He paid for Constance's housing for the remainder of the year, without being asked, because she had missed 3 weeks of work when he was first hospitalized, and he was not a man who forgot what people had given him. He set up an education fund for Millie, properly and legally, and with the kind of financial structure that would mean something when she was 18. And he did this quietly, without ceremony, the way you do things for people you actually care about rather than people you want to be seen caring about. Margaret, who had sat beside his bed for 3 days holding a rope she refused to drop. He simply called every Sunday, just to talk, just to be present across the distance in the way she had been present, across a much larger distance when it mattered most. And Millie, who was 4 by the time Elliot was well enough to visit, ran to him when he came through the door of Constance's apartment, ran with the specific enthusiasm of someone greeting a person they have always simply expected to see again, and held up Thomas the bear for his inspection, because Thomas had apparently acquired a small tear on his ear in the intervening months, and Elliot's opinion on the matter was required. Elliot sat on the floor with her and looked seriously at the bear's ear and agreed that it was a situation that warranted attention, and they discussed it for some time, and Constance stood in the kitchen doorway, watching this with an expression she didn't try to manage. Later, after Millie was in bed and Constance and Elliot sat at the kitchen table with coffee, he said, "She just put her hand on my face." "Yes," Constance said. "That was all? That was all?" Elliot was quiet for a moment. The apartment was small and warm and smelled of the dinner they'd had and the coffee, now, and the particular lived-in quality of a home that is full of a child's presence, even when the child is asleep. "My doctors can't explain it," he said. "No," Constance agreed. "What do you think happened?" Constance wrapped both hands around her. Mug. Considered. I think she wasn't afraid, she said finally. And I think you felt that. And I think sometimes that's enough. To feel that someone isn't afraid of you coming back. Elliot turned his mug in his hands, slowly, the way a person turns something over when it means more than they're ready to say out loud. I think you're right, he said. Outside, the evening was quiet and ordinary and full of the small sounds of a neighborhood going about its life. Inside, two people sat at a kitchen table in the warm light, and somewhere down the hall a little girl slept with her bear. And the world, which had for a few days seemed to be closing, had opened again the way worlds do when someone refuses to stop waiting.